An ancient ghost gives him the ability to steal any sword master's skill just by devouring his sword. But seeing the red-hot steel burning in front, he is having second thoughts. But then suddenly the guy makes his resolve stronger, opens his mouth, and starts devouring the red-hot steel and takes a large bite out of it. Ever since he was a kid, Arahan had grown up hearing the same story from his father. His father would always speak with that serious look, telling him to remember this above all else, that as a member of the Karawan family, there was something he could never forget. They might be living in a tiny territory far from the capital now, but 200 years ago, the Karawans had supposedly stood at the very peak of prestige. Back then, there had been a knight known as the God of War, righteous warriors favored by the king himself and revered by everyone. A family chosen by the sword, one that produced sword masters generation after generation. That was why people had once spoken their name with respect. The invincible guardians, the Karawans. And one day, Arahan would inherit that name. He was told to live with pride, to believe that steel ran through his veins, and to shoulder the mission of reclaiming their former glory and standing tall again as protectors of the land. But later on, standing out in the fields surrounded by healthy crops, Arahan couldn't help but feel differently. Those heroic tales his father loved to tell, they were probably nothing more than tall stories. It wasn't unusual for fallen nobles to cling to made-up glories of the past. After all, if the Karawans had really been as great as the stories claimed, there was no way they'd be ruling over some backwater village like this, or spending their days farming side by side with commoners. Around him, people went about their work, dealing with everyday things. Someone asked if the harvest could be stacked over there. Another answered politely, calling him young master. Life went on, busy and ordinary. As Arahan helped tend to the fields, his doubts only grew. The more he thought about it, the less sense his father's stories made. There were far too many holes. Take the old portrait of the family founder, for example. No matter how much he stared at it, the man looked nothing like him or his father. Even the so-called heirloom sword displayed alongside it was far too sharp and pristine for something that was supposed to be centuries old. And most telling of all, in every history book across the kingdom, the name of their supposed ancestor, Liam Karawan, didn't appear even once. When he put all of that together, there was only one conclusion he could reach. It was all a lie. Nothing more than stories made up to give the next generation something to feel proud about. Another voice snapped him out of it, asking why he was just standing there spacing out and reminding him that it was snack time. Someone else chimed in, saying that if he didn't hurry, all the warm bread would be gone. And if he took any longer, they were going to eat his share too. Arahan immediately panicked, shouting for them to wait and begging them to leave some for him. Not long after, the man who'd been stuffing his face got lightly smacked by his wife. Apparently the bread had gotten stuck in his throat because he ate too much. Watching the whole scene from a distance, Arahan couldn't help but laugh. At that moment, he felt it clearly. Who cared if the Karawans weren't some legendary family? He had people like this around him, people who welcomed him so naturally. That was enough. Smiling, he started running toward them, thinking that he genuinely loved this place, this life where he could live alongside everyone. This was the Karawan family he wanted, just the way it was now. Or at least, that's what he believed in his peaceful, complacent adulthood. Later that day, as he mounted his horse and prepared to leave, Arahan mentioned that they'd already met today's harvest goal, so he'd head to the market in the neighboring village. He warned them he'd be back late and said he planned to pick up a few necessities while he was there. He casually added that he should probably get Kuan some apples, since Kuan had been complaining about not seeing fruit in a while. Kuan laughed and said he'd really appreciate that. Arahan then mentioned Marino's youngest daughter, noting that her birthday was coming up and that he'd try to find a pretty doll for her. Marino looked surprised, wondering how Arahan knew that. Arahan only laughed it off, boasting that of course he knew. After all, he was going to be their next lord. With that, he waved and said he was off. Everyone saw him out, wishing him a safe trip and calling him by name as he rode away. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, Arahan's figure grew smaller and smaller in the distance. Once he was gone, the people left behind started chatting among themselves. Someone remarked that there really was no one else like their young master. Another agreed, saying he was on a completely different level compared to other nobles. Someone else joked that they were already worried about which lady would end up snatching him away. But soon, their expressions grew serious. They reminded each other that it was getting late and that they still had work to finish. After all, today was the day of the regular meeting with the Lord. And with that, the calm atmosphere shattered as chaos began to spread everywhere. The others were completely stunned. No one could believe what was happening. This wasn't something they had ever imagined. A sudden, violent overturning of everything they knew. Someone coldly declared that this territory territory had to be erased, and they kept moving forward, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. People desperately asked who they were, but no answer came back. There was only the sword. As one man muttered about this territory, his words trailed off, and then the blade fell. He repeated it almost mechanically, saying it must be erased, and he carried out those words without hesitation. The apples Arahan had bought, the dolls meant as gifts, all of them lay scattered across the ground, trampled and stained. When Arahan finally returned, his mind went blank. He called out, asking where everyone was. There was no response. As he looked around and saw bodies everywhere, panic took hold. He kept asking why everyone was dead, his voice breaking as reality sank in. Then he felt someone right behind him, hands reaching out. Before he could turn around, the person pulled him close and covered his eyes, telling him not to look. Arahan froze, then realized from the familiar presence that it was the butler. He shakily asked if it was really him, insisting that something was wrong, that he had to be seeing things. He kept crying out about the villagers, unable to accept what was in front of him. The butler's voice, however, was calm, terrifyingly so. He said that he had arrived, that the order had been given, that the caravans had to be erased. It had only taken 10 minutes. A man wielding a blade that showed no emotion, no warning, no hesitation had descended upon them. In that short span of time, half the villagers had been wiped out. When it was over, the man simply stated that he was following orders. Just like that, half of the caravans disappeared. A sword master, no, a calamity carried out by a single man. Inside the castle, the scene was no different. Bodies lay scattered everywhere, the aftermath of a calamity that had struck without the slightest warning. Arahan walked through the halls in a daze, staring at faces he knew all too well, people who used to greet him warmly every time he passed. Now, none of them said a word. They never would again. His tears wouldn't stop. Then, through the ringing in his ears, he heard someone calling his name, again and again. Arahan froze before realizing it was his mother's voice. In that instant, a tiny spark of hope flared up inside him. She rushed over and hugged him tightly, thanking the heavens that he was safe. For just a split second, wrapped in his mother's warmth, Arahan felt like he could finally breathe again. And then he noticed it. Another voice, trembling and broken, repeating the same word over and over, asking why this had happened, why them. The world before his eyes turned red, stained by blood and despair. That was when Arahan understood that the tragedy was far from over. The sword master who had erased half of the Karawan territory in the blink of an eye had spared his parents. No one knew why. He had only left behind a single message, that he would return in 1 month. If they wished to live, they were to take everyone and leave this place before then. His father had screamed at him, demanding to know why this was happening to them, what sin they could have possibly committed to deserve such cruelty. But the sword master had only turned away, pausing briefly before coldly saying that he was merely following orders. Those words lingered like a curse. After that, the surviving residents began to flee. One by one, they packed what little they could, mounted their horses, and left the village behind. It was the only way to survive. But for Arahan's family, even that choice didn't truly exist. Crushed by responsibility and his own helplessness as a lord, Arahan's father finally broke. He spoke as if trying to convince himself, calling himself a great knight, a dragon slayer, an iron-blooded guardian of the kingdom. He swore that it was his duty to confront the great evil that was approaching, that he would never retreat. Arahan remembered those words clearly, because his father was standing right there when he said them. His mother, on the other hand, knelt in front of Arahan and told him she would never give up on him. She explained that the butler had already prepared a carriage and that Arahan had to leave the territory with him, as far away as possible. Arahan panicked, insisting that she had to come too. He said they could somehow take their father with them, that the whole family could escape together. But his mother gently shook her head. She said that the Lord of Karawan would never leave this place. Until his very last moment, he would choose to face the enemy as the Lord of the Karawan family. She said she would stay by his father's side until the very end. Arahan broke down immediately, begging her not to say things like that, pleading with her to leave together with him. But instead of answering directly, her voice seemed to sink straight into his heart. She told him to listen carefully. The stories the Lord had told him all his life, the righteous watchers, the invincible guardians, none of them were true. It was a history built entirely on lies. And because of that, she wanted him to promise her something. She made him swear that he would never pick up a sword for the rest of his life, that no matter what happened, he would survive, that he would never think about revenge, never look back, and simply live on for his own sake. Just then, the butler announced that the carriage was ready. She turned to him and asked him to take good care of Arahan, to make sure they were as far away as possible before that man returned. The butler agreed, even as he forcefully pulled Arahan away. Arahan struggled, crying out for his mother, calling her name again and again. She didn't answer. She only closed her eyes. The butler kept moving, telling him he had to go. Arahan kept crying, his voice breaking as he called out to her, but she never responded. Only after they had gone some distance did she finally collapse, clutching her chest as she whispered that she loved him. Back at the castle, his father stood there, crushed and hollow. His mother walked over and wrapped her arms around him, telling him not to suffer alone, that at least at the very end, she would stay with him. Inside the carriage, the butler remained silent for a long while before finally speaking. He told Arahan that he knew how agonizing and unbearable this was, but he had to endure it. That man was a calamity, a natural disaster, something humans like them could not fight. The only way forward was to accept today's tragedy and forget it. Only then could he live on. That was surely what the Lord and his lady wanted. Then the butler turned around. Arahan wasn't there. The carriage was already moving, but Arahan was running through the forest, his thoughts in chaos. No matter how much he tried to justify it, he couldn't leave his parents behind and run away alone. He refused to abandon them. A god of war or a sword master, no matter what people called him, he was still just a human, and humans could die. An arrow through the heart would kill anyone. Arahan had spent the past month secretly gathering deadly poisons. If he could just land a single shot, he was certain he could protect them both. Driven by that belief, he ran back toward the castle. And that was when he noticed it. Everything ahead of him was stained an eerie red. Only then did Arahan finally see it clearly. The people he had wanted to protect were gone. Every last one of them. A crushing despair flooded his chest, so heavy it almost stopped his breathing. Right there stood the calamity itself, as if mocking him, telling him how foolish it was to come all this way just to die. It said it had already shown him mercy. Arahan snapped. The moment he saw his mother lying there, something inside him completely shattered. Rage and sorrow burst out all at once. He screamed until his throat burned, until his voice nearly gave out. With shaking hands, he raised his crossbow, his vision blurred with tears, shouting that he would kill him. But his body refused to move. His fingers went numb. The strength drained out of him. The crossbow slipped from his hands and hit the ground with a dull sound, and Arahan collapsed right after it. His throat felt unbearably heavy, as if something was crushing it from the inside. The calamity looked down at him and spoke calmly. He said Arahan hadn't even turned 18 yet, and that he should consider himself lucky. He wouldn't take his life today. Instead, Arahan was told to drown in despair, to rot away in it. Not a single trace of the Karawans would be allowed to remain on this continent. And if he ever dared to carry on that bloodline, he would be found again. The Karawans were to vanish, just like this. And then the man left. Arahan couldn't do anything. He could only cry. He crawled to his mother's side, pathetically. So pathetically, he thought, and sobbed without the power to change anything. Not just his mother, his father too. That day, he lost everything. That's what he believed. But then, no. A faint glow suddenly flickered from a nearby sword. Arahan's breath caught as he muttered that maybe he was wrong. Just then, a voice echoed out, told him to show some respect. Arahan froze, stunned, as the old portrait began to glow. Light gathered, forming an aura, slowly shaping itself into a person. And the man who emerged looked exactly like the figure in the painting. He gazed down at Arahan and spoke to his descendant. 12 months had passed since the day I dug graves for everyone on this land. Arahan thought back on that year and realized that every single day had been spent sharpening one thing alone, his vengeance. The man at the center of it all stood at the very summit. He was hailed as the peerless blade of this era, the shield that upheld the realm's stability, the sanctified judge who purged evil in the name of order, a transcendent sword master, blessed with talent that eclipsed all others. Carlos, the master of the 10 swords, that was the monster who had stripped Arahan of his home, his family, and his very soul. Yet even now, the truth remained buried in darkness. What reason did he have to slaughter the Karawans? Who was truly pulling the strings from behind the scenes? And what kind of hidden legacy was entwined with the Karawan name? No matter what answers waited at the end of that path, one thing would never change. Nothing could bring back the Karawan family, who had perished like dogs on that day. And yet back then, when the portrait had begun to glow, Erahan remembered freezing in place, struck by a strange sensation. For a moment, he had wondered if the weight of all those unanswered questions had finally broken his mind. An impossibility was unfolding right before his eyes. That was when the voice had spoken, telling him to show some decorum, reminding him that the same blood flowed through his veins. Erahan could still recall the disbelief. The figure he had once dismissed as nothing more than a fairy tale, the legend woven into ancestral tapestries, had stepped out into reality. He had heard scholars say that those shattered by unbearable tragedy often succumb to vivid hallucinations born of grief. But this presence was different. It was heavy, overwhelmingly real. He could feel it pressing down on him. The figure had calmly pointed out the storm raging inside Erahan's chest, asking whether he feared madness, or whether he was simply stunned by the sight of an ancestor he thought never existed. Erahan had stayed silent. There was nothing he could say to that. After a long pause, he had finally spoken, asking if this wasn't a dream, if this wasn't a ghost. Then was he truly the patriarch who forged the Karawan name? The legendary conqueror, Liam Karawan? And then the questions he'd been suppressing had spilled out. If he was really the hero from his father's stories, then why did he wait until everything had turned to ash? Why appear only now? Why stand by and let them die? Erahan had demanded an answer, rage burning hot inside him. Liam hadn't replied right away. He had only watched him in silence for a moment before finally speaking. He said he required proof of Erahan's resolve. Revenge, after all, was a poison that consumed the soul. No one should touch it without the will to be burned by it completely. For an entire year, he explained, he had been watching. Silently, he had watched a boy whose talent was so meager it bordered on hopeless. He had watched as that boy refused to drop his blade, even as his hands split and bled every single day. He said he had seen it clearly, a will that simply refused to go out, no matter how violently despair tried to snuff it away. So why now? Why appear only at this moment? The answer, according to him, was simple. The hatred in Erahan's eyes had finally matured into something deep enough, and at the same time, his own patience had run dry. Toward those who had dared to wipe out his bloodline and butcher his people, his desire to tear them apart had begun to overflow as well. He spoke of a rule that had never once been broken throughout history. Only a sword master could kill another sword master. Erahan had already known this, which was why he had thrown himself into training like a madman, swinging his blade as if chasing a phantom called revenge. But that was exactly the problem. No matter how many decades he spent alone like that, he would never reach his enemy. A sword master, he explained, was no longer bound by human limits. They were anomalies, beings who had stepped beyond the ceiling of mankind, into a realm even geniuses could never touch. And among those monsters, Carlos stood even higher, a titan perched atop an unreachable peak. Even back in an age soaked in blood, men like him had been rare. In this era, there was no one capable of ending him. And as time passed, his shadow would only stretch farther, darker than before. Hearing that shook Erahan to his core. He already understood the gap between them better than anyone. But did that really mean justice was impossible? Was he supposed to watch the man who destroyed his world continue being praised as a savior? Was he destined to remain a powerless bystander yet again? That was when Liam spoke again. From this moment onward, Erahan's fate would change course. Liam himself would become his foundation. He would forge Erahan into a blade even more terrifying than Carlos, so that the last Karawan could personally execute the murderer who had taken everything from him. There was only one path, he said, a road that existed solely for their bloodline. He commanded the sword to devour. And once more, we returned to that first moment, where Erahan stood at the start of his path, sword in hand, blood burning, destiny finally set in motion. Liam explained that it had all started with him, a half-bloodsmith. The Karawan bloodline didn't inherit a dwarf's short stature, but it did carry something far stranger. A single, miraculous trait carved straight into their DNA. The ability to internalize a blade. To put it simply, by ingesting a sword, they could absorb its memories, its essence, and even the secret techniques of its former master. That hidden power was what had driven the Karawans to the peak of martial nobility, giving birth to an entire dynasty of sword masters. Erahan could barely keep up with what he was hearing. Absorbing power by eating metal? He knew dwarves were masters of the forge, but this kind of grotesque ability had never appeared appeared in any record. It sounded insane, like the ravings of a madman. His head was spinning from one revelation after another. But in the end, reality wasn't judged by logic. It was judged by results. And for someone who had already lost everything, doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. So he asked the only thing that mattered. How did he do it? How did he devour the steel? Liam said the method was primitive. Heat the sword until the edge softened, until the metal yielded. Then grind it down with his teeth and swallow it. Erahan couldn't help thinking that maybe this really was the final hallucination of a broken mind. Maybe he was being deceived by something far worse. But even so, if there was even the slightest chance, no matter how small, he would take it. And so he did. He bit into the sword like it was nothing more than a crunchy chip. Again and again, he kept eating, ignoring the searing heat, ignoring the pain as the metal burned him from the inside. He didn't stop. Flames soon wrapped around his body, swallowing him whole. Then, suddenly, he felt warmth slide down his throat. A voice declared that it was done. Over and over, Erahan repeated the same words in his mind, as if carving them into his soul. Never forget, never forget, never forget. Liam echoed it as well, reinforcing the vow. And then, without hesitation, Erahan prepared to consume more. He told himself he would see this through to the end, even if it meant losing his humanity, even if it turned him into something inhuman. He would see it through. He would become the sword master who would one day tear that man's heart out. Morning light filtered in as the sun rose over a quiet tree and a small house nearby. Inside, Erahan was practically shouting, half in disbelief, half in excitement. He was alive, not just barely alive. There wasn't even a scratch on his body. The pain of swallowing red-hot iron had been so real that he'd been convinced it might have all been a dream. But now, holding nothing but the sword's hilt in his hand, it was obvious that it hadn't been. If it were just a dream, there was no way this would still be here. A voice responded calmly, almost amused. For someone with such a fragile body, his mental fortitude was apparently decent enough. Even among his ancestors, many had quit halfway, unable to endure that burning agony. The voice pointed out that Erahan believed it now, didn't he? That the legends his father told about the caravans were real, and that this presence wasn't just a hallucination born from grief. Erahan tried to speak, but for a moment, no words came out. Then he steadied himself, bowed deeply, and formally greeted the founder of the caravan family. The reply was immediate. He was told to call him Master. Everyone who had ever received his teachings had done so. Erahan accepted that without hesitation. Calling him Master, he asked if this meant he had finally inherited that great power his father used to talk about. If consuming swords really granted strength, just like what had been explained the night before, then shouldn't he feel different by now? Stronger? The answer wasn't what he expected. Apparently, there was a slight problem, not on the speaker's side, but on Erahan's. The original plan, he explained, had been simple. Have Erahan consume his cherished sword and instantly elevate him to the level of a sword master. But over generations, the bloodline had thinned. While Erahan still possessed the ability to consume swords, his capacity to properly digest the power inside them had weakened drastically. In simple terms, with his current body, fully processing the essence of that sword was impossible. Erahan was stunned. The explanation made his head spin, but he still nodded. If that was what his master said, then it had to be true. That calm acceptance seemed to surprise the other party. Was that really all he had to say? Erahan replied honestly. He'd always known his body had limits. Sure, the result was disappointing, but he was grateful all the same. At least another path still existed. Another path? Erahan explained his thinking. If it was impossible in his current state, that meant it wouldn't always be impossible. Someday, he would be able to digest that power. Until then, all he had to do was find food that matched what his body could handle right now. In other words, start smaller and keep moving forward. Liam seemed genuinely amused. He remarked that Erahan's way of thinking was already on par with a swordmaster's. When it came to swords, the more worn and used they were, the better. He told Erahan to lead the way to somewhere filled with old, discarded weapons, adding that he would personally choose which ones were suitable. As they made their way there, Liam looked around and commented on how gloomy the place felt. He even joked that dark mages would absolutely love an environment like this. Erahan explained that all the junk from the slums eventually ended up here. Everything from worthless scrap metal to weapons that could no longer be used. If they were looking for old swords like the ones Liam described, there was no better place. Liam nodded in approval. He said it was a good start. Back in his own early days, he had devoured swords in places that reeked of blood just like this. Blades clutched by fallen soldiers, axes buried in dirt and gore, spears with shattered shafts scattered across the ground. He had eaten whatever he could find, pushing himself to grow stronger, simply to survive. For some reason, standing there stirred memories memories of those times. Endless clashes, weapons breaking again and again, all in the name of protecting a fragile spark of life. Some people died that day, others lived to see tomorrow. On those battlefields, countless lives vanished without leaving a trace, yet somehow, there was always a single point of brilliant light left behind. Liam suddenly said he'd found it. He pointed in a certain direction and told Arahan to pick it up. That blade would be his second sword, the next one he had to devour. 1 month later, a different group of voices echoed through the area. Someone said it was fine, just as they'd heard. There was no one around. No villagers, no signs of life anywhere. Another person wondered aloud if the manor had once been used as a dark mage's biolab before being abandoned. Someone else immediately dismissed that idea, saying they'd be dead the moment they stepped inside if that were true. It was far more likely that some fallen noble was hiding out there. Another voice chimed in, saying they could smell it, that arrogant, high and mighty scent lingering everywhere. One of them casually dropped onto a luxurious couch and laughed, saying their luck had finally turned. If there wasn't even a caretaker around, then it was basically a free win. Someone else started poking around the place and suddenly sounded surprised. It looked like a noble's daughter really did live there. There was an entire pile of fine women's clothing, freshly washed. Another person reacted in disbelief, asking if that was true. The first one chuckled and added that even the scent clinging to the fabric was different, clearly amused by the discovery. Another one chimed in, licking his lips as he glanced at his sword, muttering that if they played their cards right, they might even get to have a bit of extra fun. Someone else immediately got excited, telling him to hand it over so he could take a whiff too, joking about whether there was a portrait lying around. Maybe there was a girl they could make use of. That was when a sharp voice cut through the room, shouting at them to stop. They froze as Arahan stepped inside. He calmly told them that his mother liked things clean and absolutely hated it when people made a mess. He asked them to put everything down quietly, adding that he'd prefer it if they just talked things out. For a brief moment, the thieves went silent. Then they burst out laughing. One of them mocked him, asking who this brat was and whether he was the owner's son. Another sounded disappointed, saying it wasn't even a girl. Someone else sighed in agreement, clearly losing interest. Arahan didn't raise his voice. He simply asked if they'd come looking for food or if they just needed a place to stay. If it was either of those, they could just say so. In that case, he was even willing to accept them as neighbors. That only made the laughter worse. They cursed at him, wondering what nonsense the kid was spouting, saying he had clearly lost his mind. Typical nobles, they scoffed. No sense of fear at all. One of them sneered that he should have stayed hidden instead of crawling out like this. With the fireplace blazing, Arahan stared at the thin piece of metal in his hand and couldn't help asking if this was really the sword he was supposed to eat. It looked more like a needle than a blade. If he tried to cut anything with it, it felt like it would snap instantly. His master said that was only natural. From the beginning, that weapon had never been meant for slashing or smashing things apart. It was forged for a single purpose, to pierce straight through an enemy's vitals and end their life in one decisive moment. A sword made purely for the thrust. Arahan turned it over in his hand, thinking that if it was only for thrusting, then something familiar and stable, like a spear, would make more sense. His thoughts must have shown on his face, because his master pointed it out directly, saying he looked like he was thinking a spear would be better. That made Arahan a bit nervous. But his master continued, saying that while the doubt wasn't wrong, for someone as young and weak as Arahan, nothing was more valuable than the memories sleeping inside this blade. Before its owner died, she had personally taken the lives of more than 2,000 enemies. And she had done it all with the body of a woman, one even frilier than Arahan's. So he was told to show some respect and eat it. The steel itself might be light, but what it carried within was the heavy, solemn weight of a human life. By inheriting that woman's memories, Arahan would gain far more than just technique. The moment he did, visions flooded in. The last thing the child remembered was a manor engulfed in flames. Someone was calling her name, asking if she was awake. When the girl, no more than 10 years old, opened her eyes, the world she knew was already gone. Her parents had been reduced to unrecognizable ash. When she was told that she alone had survived, the child softly wished she had died with them. After losing everything in an instant, she was sent to an orphanage. And the day she realized that place worshipped the goddess of fire, believing flames to be a form of salvation, she felt herself dragged straight back into despair. She couldn't understand it. Fire had taken everything from her, yet she was forced to live somewhere that treated it as sacred. No matter where she went, she still hadn't escaped the flames. The days that followed were quietly horrific. People whispered whenever they saw her. Someone mocked the burns that covered half her face. Someone else said they'd heard she was cursed by the goddess goddess herself. Someone else sneered that those marks on her face really were from a curse, letting out an awkward laugh. Another followed up, saying it was no wonder she looked so gross. Wherever she went, whispers followed. People saying she gave them the creeps, calling her a monster, disgusting, horrible. Hearing those words day after day crushed the child. She prayed constantly for it all to end. She wanted to escape the fire that replayed behind her eyelids whenever she closed her eyes, and the fire of hatred that surrounded her the moment she opened them. And then, one day, everything changed. Looking back, his swordsmanship had been rough and crude, but to her, it was beautiful, beautiful enough to drown out the hell inside her head, even if only for a moment. His name was Hegel, an old swordsman and former wandering knight who had worked at the orphanage for years. Normally, she would never have dared speak to someone with such a stern face, but that day, she felt something stir inside her. She wanted to be like him, so she gathered her courage and asked how she could become like him, saying she wanted to learn. That was her first step toward living. Hegel looked at her for a long moment before telling her that this kind of thing wouldn't help much with living, especially not for a girl like her. A blade like that would only end up hurting her. He told her to go back inside, but Mary shook her head. She said that if she could learn it, she didn't think she'd be afraid anymore. Not of fire, not of anything in this world. Something in her words reached him. Without another comment, Hegel led her to a barrel filled with swords and told her to pick one, any of them. If she could swing it, he'd teach her. Mary walked over, stared at the weapons, then picked one up. She asked if she really had to swing it. Hegel replied that if she didn't, then what was the point? She looked down at her own fingers gripping the hilt and said that as long as she could fight back, it didn't matter. Then she moved. The sword shot forward in a straight line, aimed directly at Hegel's throat. She declared that she would become whatever it took. That was her first thrust. And just like that thrust back then, Arahan's blade pierced forward now, taking another life as he repeated calmly that they weren't visitors, just uninvited guests. The thief didn't even understand what had happened before he collapsed to the ground. The others froze in shock, staring at the body. Someone muttered in disbelief, asking what they had just seen. Another wondered if this was some kind of joke. Arahan looked at them coldly and said that, in that case, there was no need to talk anymore. The master watched quietly, thoughts moving on their own. For an entire month, he hadn't taught his young descendant anything resembling swordsmanship. Not a single technique. All he'd given him was a brutal physical training routine, one meant to let him run for hours without tiring, to build a body that wouldn't collapse halfway through a fight. And yet, the thrust Arahan had just executed was clean, precise. That could only mean one thing. He was digesting it properly. With that realization, the master finally spoke, telling him to show it, to take his first true step as a Karawan. Arahan didn't hesitate. He steadied his breathing, lowered his stance, and kept the thin blade, no, the needle, resting quietly at his side. Ready. The master was already piecing it together. The exact spot where the intruder had been skewered, between the ribs, straight through the lung, wasn't something you could hit by accident. It required surgical precision. For someone like Arahan, who had no formal dueling background and no real combat history, there was no logical reason he should be able to pull off a thrust like that. And yet, there was only one explanation: the needle's previous owner. The memories Arahan had absorbed a month ago, Mary's memories, were guiding his body. From that day on, Mary's story continued. Hegel became her silent instructor. He taught her everything that mattered: how to stand, how the hilt should rest in her palm, how to feel the rhythm of a fight, and the cold, unavoidable rules of survival. His style wasn't some polished academic sword art. It carried the wild, lawless spirit of a wandering hedge knight, rough but powerful and strangely captivating. For a young girl trapped in the shadow of her fears, Mary truly admired that way of the sword. As the years passed, Hegel's body began to fail him. One day, he told her that the time was coming when she would have to leave those walls behind. When that moment arrived, he wanted her to go out and see the vastness of the world for herself. That, he said, was his final lesson, and he was grateful that his journey ended by her side. Mary was devastated, but she still thanked him. She said she owed him everything and told him to rest peacefully. Following his last words, she turned her back on the orphanage and stepped into the unknown. Before long, thieves and danger blocked her path at every turn. It didn't take many years before she built a name for herself as a mercenary. Maybe it was her strange choice of weapon, a thin, needle-like blade, or maybe it was because she was a woman on the front lines. Either way, people began calling her the Stitching Gypsy. As those memories flooded into him, Arahan realized what was happening. This had to be the summoning his forefather mentioned. An entire life's worth of experience was pouring into his mind, whispering guidance with every breath. In front of him, a thief broke down, stammering and begging to be spared, promising anything if he was just given one chance. Arahan didn't hesitate. He simply told himself to finish the job, and did. As the body fell, a strange realization settled in. This was the first life he had ever taken, and yet it felt hollow. There was no surge of guilt, no wave of horror. Only a calm assessment of the situation remained in his thoughts. He'd found that opening because the enemy hadn't seen him as a threat, but now that he was surrounded, he couldn't rely on that mistake happening again. They outnumbered him. Anyone could see that. The odds were clearly in their favor, so why weren't they moving? Why were they hesitating? From behind him, the master gave the answer. They were frozen by fear. And that was only natural. What Arahan had just shown wasn't the sloppy flailing of a beginner. A little fear kept people alive, but too much of it blinded them. It stopped them from thinking. One of the thieves panicked, asking what they were supposed to do. Another snapped back that he had no idea, clearly just as terrified. The master continued calmly. Fear had a way of magnifying the enemy, turning them into something far larger and more terrifying than they really were. It tricked the mind into believing it was facing an unstoppable force. Right now, in their eyes, Arahan wasn't a child anymore. He was a butcher, a living one. Arahan nodded to himself. If that was the case, then the opening was already there. He moved. As he closed the distance, someone screamed at him to stay back, threatening to kill him. The attack came in wild and desperate, but Arahan slipped past it effortlessly. Another curse was hurled his way as the man swung again, only for Arahan to evade once more and step straight into range, driving his blade forward in a clean, piercing strike. He remembered Hagel's words. Since he lacked a man's size and stamina, he could never allow a fight to drag on. The thieves were still screaming, still frozen, never realizing that their only chance had been to rush him all at once. Instead, they stood there, watching as Arahan kept moving, never stopping. Mary's voice echoed in his mind, calm and precise. Within the first exchange, at most the second, you had to end it. So he did. As another body fell, her thoughts continued guiding him. Run them through. Don't try to imitate what you don't have. Sharpen what you already possess. Her greatest strength had always been her lithe body, agile like a dancer's. From any stance, any angle, she could strike. That same flow now guided Arahan's movements, letting him dismantle his enemies one by one. He saw it clearly, the opening at the throat. The last remaining thief could only stare, completely paralyzed, words spilling out in disbelief. He couldn't even understand what he was seeing anymore. That little monster in front of him, just what in the world was he? Under the moonlight, down below, Arahan and his master worked in silence, digging graves side by side. After a while, the master spoke, asking if Arahan could finally set his doubts aside. If someone had the stamina to swing a sword all day without losing their breath, then for untrained thugs were nothing. Not alone. Not together. That was what it meant to be a Karawan, one who grew stronger in the middle of life and death combat. Arahan knew it was true. Everything his master had said lined up perfectly with what he'd just experienced. His body moved with a dancer's flexibility, almost as if it was responding on its own to the memories sleeping inside the blade. Once the fight began, Mary's memories had come rushing back, vivid and clear, and now he finally understood. At least a little. He understood what kind of resolve it took to fight against the world like she had. So this was it. The power to grow stronger by understanding your enemy. Just as his master said, the power of digestion. The master warned him then. He said he never lied when it came to the sword. From here on out, Arahan's days would be filled with pain. Endless hardship. Trials so brutal that death might seem like an easier choice. Someday he would look back on today and think of it as mercy. Even knowing that, could he still walk this path? Arahan didn't hesitate. If it meant putting a blade to Carlos's throat, then he would move forward no matter what that path demanded. He called out to his master again and again, his resolve unwavering. Later, under a bright sun, that resolve began to tremble. Climbing a steep hill, exhaustion finally caught up to him. His legs felt heavy, his breath ragged. Doubt crept back in as he wondered aloud whether this path was really the right one. The master immediately called him out. Where had that gaze from last night gone? Why had doubt flared up again already? Then he added that, truthfully, This too was part of Arahan's nature. He'd always been like this since he was a child. That flaw or strength would need to be addressed someday. But first, he said, he would answer Arahan's question. The path of the sword was divided into 5 stages. The first was the sword beginner, the entrance to the sword itself, a realm anyone with even a hint of talent could step into. Next came the sword walker, then the sword runner, those who established themselves as strong and became the backbone of the battlefield. Above them stood the sword expert, heroes capable of turning the tide of war single-handedly. And finally, reigning over all swordsmen, revered like gods, the realm of the heart sword, the sword master. The master asked him where he thought he stood right now among those stages. Arahan answered honestly. He figured the master probably wanted something bold or spirited, but he knew his own limits too well for that. The prerequisite to even step into the path of a sword master was mana. Having enough of it, being able to manipulate it, and most importantly, forming a mana heart, a second heart altogether. Since he hadn't formed one yet, he didn't think he even qualified as a beginner. The master laughed at that. He said Arahan's self-assessment was surprisingly accurate. He really was an amateur among amateurs, someone who hadn't even crossed the threshold of the sword. That was exactly why this training existed, to drag someone like him onto the beginner's path and force the birth of a mana heart. That was when Arahan finally snapped. He asked if the master was seriously saying they were risking his life here just to form a mana heart, doing it in a place where one wrong move could get him killed. Maybe things were different in the master's era, but in the present day, forming a mana heart wasn't even considered difficult anymore. An alchemist's potion could do it. A knight of the walker class could inject mana and open one's senses. Even noble ladies who only learned swordsmanship for self-defense could form one without trouble. So why go through all this? Why insist on the hardest possible method when an easy path existed? He genuinely couldn't understand it. The master didn't deny any of that. He agreed, forming a mana heart by itself wasn't difficult at all. There was no reason Arahan couldn't do it the conventional way. But the problem wasn't the mana heart. The power sleeping inside Karawan blood was the power of firm steel. To wield it, one needed a vessel just as steady. An ordinary person's heart wouldn't suffice. The highest realm reachable with a human heart was still only the realm of humans. If Arahan truly wanted to walk the path of a sword master, there was one thing he absolutely had to possess. A heart that wouldn't even be scratched when it collided with the world. A heart of steel. And there was only one way to forge it, by driving himself to the brink of death again and again, until his physical body itself demanded a mana heart. Among all of the master's descendants, only a tiny handful had ever endured that training to the end. That alone spoke of how painful and grotesque the process was. But those few who survived it, without exception, they became sword masters. The master looked at Arahan and asked him calmly if that motivated him even a little now. Arahan clenched his hand and stepped forward without hesitation, saying it was more than enough. The moment he moved, his resolve was already clear. The master told him again that when it came to the sword, he never lied. The mana heart Arahan would obtain wouldn't be an ordinary one. Hearing that, Arahan felt his pulse quicken. He knew his master wasn't exaggerating, and that only made him want it more. The master added that there was nothing in this world more fitting for him than that path. Later that night, under a pale moon, the scene shifted east of the Verdi region, to a place called Camp Bell. A few voices carried through the darkness. Someone asked if the others had heard the rumors about the village to the west, the one called Karawan. Another answered, saying it was that eerie place where not a single person had been seen for over a year. Why would anyone even bring up such a gloomy area? Someone else chimed in, saying rumors had been spreading lately that there was something there now. When asked what kind of something, they could only shrug. Whatever it was clearly dangerous. After all, every thug who had stepped foot into that village had vanished without a trace. Some people said a monster wave that slipped past the Northern Watchers had wiped it out. Others claimed a warlock was holed up there, conducting forbidden experiments. All kinds of theories were floating around, but in the end, everyone came to the same conclusion. If you didn't want to die, you stayed away from the western village. Nearby, a shadowy figure had been listening to the entire conversation in silence. After a moment, he muttered to himself, repeating the words slowly, a village where entering meant death. He wiped his mouth and smiled faintly. That sounded like a very good place indeed. What are his goals? If you don't want to miss any of the action coming right up, subscribe now and don't forget to turn on all the notifications.